Good day everyone. So this is a bit of a tricky topic and I did a bit of research for this topic. So we'll be talking a bit about what Genshin Impact private servers are. But let me just say this up front. Do not play on private servers. You do have a risk that your in-game account, the legitimate account that you're using, can be banned, and in a worst case scenario you are giving Hoyoverse cause to probably sue you. So because you are breaking their terms of service, copyrights, and a whole host of other things, and we'll talk a bit about a couple of other additional risks that you could be facing as well. So what are private servers in Genshin Impact? Well, to understand what they are, let's just sort of look at a typical Genshin Impact experience. So here you can see I am playing on the sort of public or the legitimate Genshin servers, which basically means that my game client, in other words, the game that I've downloaded and installed onto my PC, is forever busy making a request. In other words, it's sort of sending data to the Hoyoverse computers, and it says, oh, I pressed the E button, it did some damage to the enemy, then the request gets sent to the server says, yep, we're going to validate the data, the sort of damage that you've done. It sends a sort of bit of data back, and then basically you see a number that sort of pops up on screen. In other words, everything that I do, every item I pick up, all of these things is being validated against the Hoyoverse computers. They store everything that happens in my world in a sort of database, so when I click off this game and I pick up my mobile phone, it just says, right there in the beginning, downloading resources. That's basically, it's just a resource file to tell my game client, what it needs to load in for my Genshin Impact world. And yeah, it just gives you a way of validating your experience, your progress, and all of these sorts of things. Now, a private server, in contrast, basically takes all of these exact same requests that your game does, and instead it reroutes them to a different server, to a different computer. In fact, that computer could be your own computer. And in essence, what happens is your game client now gets instructions, but those instructions are not coming from the official server. So when it comes to stuff like login details, you can bypass that. You can do some crazy stuff like give your Klee like 999,000 damage and so on. And the way in which I actually found out about these private servers was by accident looking on YouTube, where someone summoned two La Signoras on like a beachfront, and then they sort of attacked them, and I thought like, oh well, this is probably a hacker. And obviously if you click on one video, then YouTube just pops up a bunch of these private server videos, and suddenly I was just inundated with stuff like, oh, someone summons 1,000 ruin guards and attacks them with Tartaglia and the Luke and all these sorts of things. And that's where I sort of came across this concept of this idea of running a private server. In essence, what the guys can then do is they can give special commands like in your little command window, and then they can tell the server, look, tell the game to spawn me a bunch of enemies that you should not be able to spawn. In other words, private servers allow you to play the game in any way you want. And this is not necessarily a good thing, because just think about it. You can activate all the constellations, you can activate as many rewards as you want, any game progress. It's completely artificial. So that's a very, very big sort of transgression in terms of the official Hoyo Lab statements. You are basically getting artificial progress in your game because you can just manipulate the game as you want. There is no grind, there is no legitimacy behind it. And this is what the guys do when they run private servers. Now, private servers can, like I said previously, be either something that someone else hosts, which could represent a security risk for you, or it could be something that you yourself host. But there's obviously a big problem. The guys that wrote the server, or the re-implementation of the Genshin Impact server, what they've done is they've programmed it, they've put up the files and whatever, but you yourself can actually run a security risk because you're taking unknown software from people that clearly want to pirate the game, and you're running it on your PC. In fact, the very act of rerouting the request, or the request that your game client sends, actually overwrites what we call the proxy settings on your PC, which means if you wanted to go, let's say you played the private server and you now go onto your legitimate, like let's say YouTube account and whatever, you might find that your YouTube account and your Google account and all these things are acting kind of funny. And that's because your settings have been messed with and so on. And there's no real easy fix unless you really, really know what you're doing. So that is the one risk. In my sort of analysis and sort of what do you call it, investigation, I actually found that one of the variations of this private server actually gave me a very suspicious DLL. It was sort of flagged by, and I won't say what antivirus software program, but upon investigation, there is actually a very critical vulnerability associated with it. So for me, just on a virtual machine, doing this obviously in a safe environment to do so, I did find security issues. And what you don't know is the fact that these guys can always have a private backdoor. They could have a keylogger on your system. Even if they don't, there's always that risk that they can do it in the future, because guess what? If Genshin Impact updates, you obviously need to update your private server and so on. Otherwise, you're going to be forever stuck playing the wrong version of the game. So there's definitely a security risk in all of these things. Now, why should we not use private servers? Why shouldn't we play the game in the way we want? Well, I mean, I think there's obviously an ethics question here. If you're just going to sort of take someone else's effort and duplicate it without any reward, without legitimately using the content as they intended to, then, I mean, there's obviously a very big ethical question here of you pirating. And it's not something that I approve of. But there's another sort of more insidious side to this, and that is where if the developers, Hoyoverse, explicitly have a terms of service of use, and you now go and you put YouTube content showing a private server, then in essence you are doing an illegitimate content creation. In other words, you're showcasing things that us as legitimate players do not have access to, and that for me is like highly problematic, especially if there are some popular, and I won't mention who, but some popular YouTube channels and shorts and so on that actually sort of advocate this. In other words, they are illegitimately creating content and profiting off it. In other words, if I were Hoyoverse, I would just immediately put in a copyright claim and I would sue that content creator, not only for all of their revenue that they've made on these videos, but probably to remove their channel, and I'll also sue them in their personal capacity because they are breaking terms of service. Whereas it's not like Hoyoverse coming on and looking at my YouTube and be like, does this guy really have a C6 yellow on? They look at the UID, which you can see at the bottom right hand corner. They go into their systems and be like, oh yeah, this guy legitimately has a C6 loan. It's within the terms of service, so there is no grounds based off of Hoyoverse's own terms of service for them to institute a copyright claim or in any way sort of detract from the content that I'm making, because it's all legitimate, and that's the way in which it's supposed to be done. Whether you spend, whether you're free to play, there is a terms of service, but you can use the Hoyoverse assets legitimately because you're playing on legitimate servers to, in essence, get or create or get like some additional income through YouTube or through any other sort of legitimate media platform. And what the thing with private servers is that you cannot legitimately create content without risking being sued, and this is the big problem with them. One other thing you might have seen on the internet is perhaps like the use of people like using Genshin Impact's models to do like fancy dances, or they put them, if you've seen on my channel as well, I think we ran Kokomi in one of my virtual games as well. That's completely within the terms of service, and that's mostly because Hoyoverse actually makes the models in an MMD format available to you online. So within their terms of service, you can create like fan-made content like this, but to use the actual game and then to sort of get artificial progress, that is not legitimate. So that is well outside the bounds of what you're allowed to do. So yeah, this has been an exploration into private servers. I think a lot of the common arguments a lot of people bring up is, I just want to enjoy the game in my own way. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, there's lots of things that I would just want to enjoy in my own way. I would love to just drive around in a Ferrari, but obviously, as part of society, I have to legitimately work to get that car. Otherwise, a lot of people would be very suspicious. How did you get this fancy car? You know, did you cheat somehow? You sort of broke the system and so on. And this is what we call about accountability and so on, recognizing the efforts that other people have put in. Because if we don't do so, and Hoyoverse just says, well, you know what, you all have a private server, we're going to stop updating the game, that's the end of it, then who ultimately benefits? Who ultimately gets to have fun? Well, no one. And that's the problem with illegitimate content creation. It actually does take the fun out of it. Yes, Hoyoverse has got a very predatory game in terms of the prices. It's not a fair value for your transaction, but just because the product is not fairly evaluated doesn't mean you have grounds to now go and illegitimately profit or sort of play with like the game outside of the allowable terms and services. If you're not happy with the game, the monetization practice and so on, then just don't play the game. That's the best message you can send. But yeah, that is everything that I've wanted to cover on this topic. Thank you guys so much for watching and have a great day. Cheers.